And I wanted to, as I prefaced in the first bit of the show, dismantle a lot of those landmines around topics and phrases that have been contaminated by maybe Francis's or Schmidt's or other people's records that actually prove really useful for us. And one of those is anarcho-tyranny. And from the American context, both how do you understand it from your reading and how have you seen that play out?
Well, Narco-Tyranny is really just a article that Sam Francis wrote. Interestingly, he has much more in-depth and complex systems with which he tries to explain political behavior. But Narco-Tyranny is really the one that is caught on, and I think that's because it just is a word that captures exactly what many of us are feeling. In the United States especially, but of course in the UK as well, we're in a situation where the ruling class is leveraging its ability to decide the state of exception, when the law will apply and when it will not. And they use that to go ahead and punish those that would present any kind of challenge to the ruling order. And instead of applying the law to, say, violent criminals that are regularly making victims of the average person, they apply it to people who are paying their taxes and contributing to society because they do have the ability, that middle class. St. Francis was famous for talking about the revolution from the middle. They are the ones that do have some level of access to capital and institutional power that might be able to challenge the rulers. And so instead of punishing those that do terrible acts to innocent people, instead we see the state focusing on punishing those that might create any kind of challenge to their power through the application of anarcho tyranny.
Yeah, I saw a few examples of that in the last couple of years with the Department of Justice targeting parents who are protesting school board meetings where they're filling them with ideological nonsense and sexually explicit material as domestic terrorists. And then I think it was Kyle Seraphin who came out as a whistleblower and said that they've put the rosary as an extremist hate symbol on their watch list. Wasn't there also a recent thing where they said that the the what was it, Department for Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which just sounds like a libertarian's party, were monitoring Bible purchases and gun purchases.
Yeah, you could be flagged for purchasing some kind of gun from a sports store and a Bible. Those are the two most dangerous things that you can involve yourself with. The ATF is basically famous for murdering dogs in the United States. It is incredibly irresponsible law enforcement agency with a terrible track record. But it's very clear that the state's law enforcement apparatus has been turned on the law-abiding people. They're not interested in stopping any real threats to the United States. They built this entire apparatus on the idea that there was this huge threat of terrorism or violent crime, and that we had to have this panopticon that was checking on every purchase and all internet activity to make sure that we were always safe. And what they figured out was that the terror was not really a threat to the power of the regime, but was a threat to the power of the regime was your uncle with a MAGA hat, and that has become the focus of all of those enforcement mechanisms.
Yeah, Sydney Sweeney most affected there, I suppose. It's funny that you talk about the middle class. If it were just framed in the purposes of class warfare, I mean, again, leftists don't particularly care about intellectual consistency here. It's one of your favorite signs to tap is it's not about hypocrisy, it's about hierarchy. But you'd think more of them would be able to get on board with this concept. But I think they run up against the guardrail here because of Sam Francis's record of it having a ethnic connotation. People will always invoke the specter of 1350 memes. But the thing that I found really interesting in Narco Tyranny is that it seems to go against the blank slatism that the enforcement mechanism of Narco Tyranny tries to insist on. So by carrying out anarcho tyranny, you're doing it on behalf of a permanently existing criminal class that you can't ever quite eliminate against the law-abiding middle class that believe that the rule of law is what matters and not, as de Maistre said, the men that wrote the constitutions and their sentiments being upheld. But then the actual narco-tyranny as it plays out is often using speech codes to suppress those that complain about the runaway lawlessness in civilization. And so I wonder if anarcho-tyranny is a sort of inevitable consequence of the insistence on anti-racism and the blank slate by like the post-war consensus. And if this can exist under any other conditions where the law would be upheld consistently because the civilization has a set of shared sentiments that would stop them from doing it.
The debate I'm always having with my friend Nima Parvini, academic agent, is whether the ideology follows power or the power follows ideology. And the answer is really obviously both. They're always working in tandem. And so this ideology is necessary to go ahead and facilitate the consolidation of power. but the consolidation of power follows this particular path because the ideology also lays it out in that direction. They are true believers who also are using the things they believe in for their own material gains, their own gains in power. And so the requirement to believe that simply anyone can be imported into your country and allow them to go ahead and immediately have all the rights and benefits of that and expect them to simply become productive members of your society is a quasi religious belief, or really a completely religious belief on the part of our ruling class. But on top of that, allowing that, bringing that in is a classic power move of high and low versus middle, which allows them to go ahead and wage war on the existing bourgeoisie order, and that allows them to break down the social bonds, the local and regional social bonds that are holding back centralization of power and consolidate it by leveraging that criminal underclass. So does one precede the other? Really, they're just both working together to reach the same goal, which is the total state.
And similar to your book. So when you're conceiving of this panopticon, Carl and I read a book by Claire Chambers, who's a Cambridge academic, who calls for a personal state based on the idea of personal is political and a comprehensive version of liberalism, basically saying that rules stop short, and what we need is basically a bright pink painted feminist panopticon in the center of an international longhouse, right? And in order to surveil, you need to break down barriers. And something that I got from your book, but also sort of adjacent books that I'd recommend people read, like R.R. Reno's Return of the Strong Gods or Yoram Hazony's Conservatism and Rediscovery, is that these concentric circles, almost like a Russian nesting doll of history, tradition, social expectation, religious faith, had insulated people from just the naked application of arbitrary laws before. And in the post war consensus, the insistence on an open society by people like Popper and Hayek and Strauss for different epistemologies were seeking denazification, even in the nations that fought Adolf Hitler and defeated the Nazis. And so they stripped away all of those social pressures and those civilizational particularities because they thought it might create an authoritarian personality. And what you had is the sort of naked individual, what Camus would have called anti-racist man, battered by the elements of state ideology and law. And so is it those overlapping concentric circles which insulate us from being preyed upon by anarcho-tyranny? Is this why Christians were less likely to comply with lockdown laws? Is that your read on it?
Yeah, one of the most startling revelations that I gained when beginning my political journey from normie talk radio conservative to where I am now was the truth that we are always under authority. There is no world where are not under someone else's power, someone else's authority. And so therefore the only question is, what kind of authority will it be? And in a more organic society, a more traditional society, those authorities were ordered towards our good. They were ordered towards pursuing virtue, to having a shared vision and moral understanding of what society should be. We were still not completely free to do whatever we wanted in the complete libertine style that we think of today, but we had a liberty to pursue virtue, the classical understanding of what liberty really was. Today, we have this understanding of liberty as just this crass libertarian, smoke your pot and get gay married with all the guns you want. This is what liberty is truly about. But that's just not the case. And instead of freeing someone, all that really does is open them up to the power of the total state without, like you said, those overlapping concentric circles, that nesting, that web of social understanding. So these folkways, these traditions, power is not bound. The only thing that binds power is opposing power. This is something the American founders actually understood very well and got very right. And we, even as current American conservatives, seem to have completely forgotten. When they talked about power checking power in the Federalist Papers, they were just talking about formal government actions. They were talking about social spheres opposing each other: the church, the family, the community, the sovereign, the merchant. These were all different forces that would compete. And because they had these different interlocking traditions, no one power could cut through all of those things to completely rule the individual. But now, because all of those have been removed in the name of freeing the individual from those social obligations, instead, they are powerless before the state, which simply arbitrarily manipulates what was the rule of law to go ahead and bend them to their will.
Yeah, Patrick Deneen in Why Liberalism Failed essentially conceived of the liberal state as a sort of agent of dislodging, based on its anthropology of what I already mentioned, the blank slate. It thinks that we're all fundamentally the same, and then through some kind of fall, we got segmented up into disparate cultures, and that engendered inequality. And if only we can return to that sort of state of nature via the state, then we'll all be happy, clappy, free, and equal again. And I I find it demented because within liberalism itself, because we've got quite a lot of like anti-woke liberals on our side that also say that I know our mutual accidental nemesis James Lindsay has called you a Gnostic conservative, whatever the bloody hell that means, just because you recognize how power works and you don't think we can return to the 1990s. But lots of people refuse to recognize that within liberalism was the seed of its own destruction, in that it sets up an antagonistic relationship between the individual and culture as some kind of oppressive agent, that actually it needs the state to liberate the individual from those sort of concentric circles and make them a man anew, and they can be sort of self-generative and free to consume and all this sort of stuff. And so the state has an active interest in dislodging the individual from time, place, family, culture, etc. And then Deneen made a really interesting observation that I've never seen anyone really make about John Stuart Mill before, but the sort of harm principle liberalism that mutated from Locke and is now the sort of regime of advice itself as oppression that we live under, that itself has a kind of hierarchical element in that it recognizes that only an exceptional few will benefit from the liberation of constraints, not just the people that have unlimited license to vice, but it says that, oh, the stifling social circumstances of our time are limiting innovation and technological progress. And therefore, by dislodging them from social expectation, everyone will seem to benefit. Well, it seems to have created this sort of stratification into two classes, as you've said, this sort of pincer movement against the middle class who were otherwise living quite happy and productive lives within their culture. That the Burke once said, "Oh, I didn't realize I was oppressed until you turned up and told me." It's the people that can thrive under these constraints of vice and hedonism and make sort of Machiavellian plans, the fox-like people, and the people who have fallen through the cultural safety net and are now heavily dependent as a sort of criminal class, underclass without any culture, on the state. It seems to be squeezing the two in the middle, and then you get persecuted for noticing, I suppose.
Yeah, it's really a denial of the way that the system must go ahead and destroy the kind of the local and the community in order to free up, like you said, that top percentage. You know, Charles Murray and others have talked about this kind of cognitive skimming that's going on in our society because we've gone ahead and privileged the cognitive class above everyone else. We've gone ahead and created a system where we pull the brightest minds out of any given community. We take them off the top, we send them away to university, and then we go ahead and shred their IQ in the finance world or something like that. And so these people who would have led great productive lives and would have bettered the communities where they were organically planted instead are scooped out of that, poured into the machine of the regime. And we end up in this scenario where the average community is, full of people who are addicted to drugs, can't get jobs, can't form families, and they're told that they're just morally deficient because they needed what every other human being needed throughout history, a network of people who draw each other together, hold each other up, have expectations of each other, and create a shared moral understanding and vision of the future. They are deficient because they could not win this IQ rat race. And so it, like you said, we have a few people who are just desperately holding to the idea that liberalism is this system that only that kind of benefits everyone, when it becomes very clear that actually it mainly benefits a select few who can survive the moral ravages of it and lays waste to every other community.
You had a very good podcast on Nick Land's IQ shredder concept that I recommend people go and watch, because you have a very useful ability of digesting long political tracts and texts and essays into short explanatory videos, which I really like. If I can go back to the sort of namesake title of your book, because what ends up happening is this class of people often corral their interests into a hierarchy with the force of law behind which is the monopoly on force, which is the state, which is, I think, why both of us will recognize the anarcho-capitalist dream might be very nice, but it's again another elite dream where lots of people think that they're like Mill's self-generated person. If I can only just live off in the woods with my guns, I can survive on this, and no one ever will have to create a state again just for convenience because they're not quite as bright as me. I don't think that's particularly tenable. But these people organize and they infiltrate the state and they amass power to themselves. And you as the spectre has already been raised, got the word from Schmidt, who's another person who, as of recent, his insights have been resurrected from the dustbin of history because he picked the wrong party in the 1930s. A good friend of mine over, who also writes at the European Conservative, Harrison Pitt, wrote the following in a massive essay he's just put out in Schmidt, which I'll link down in the description. And he said, Schmidt diverges from the sociologist Max Weber, who, following in a German tradition begun by Hegel's hymns to the men of Bildung, who would make up the universal class of the rational state, had hailed the modern age of technocrats. Given the shortcomings of the liberal discussing class, Weber praised bureaucracies for their technical, rational capacity to produce an impersonal, rules-based order, the dangerous alternative being a regime founded on the all-too-personal commands of a charismatic sovereign. Schmidt rejected the optimistic faith, then dormant in jurisprudence, that all personal elements could be removed from the state. Such forlorn hopes, he held, stemmed from the liberal myth of neutrality in human affairs. Now, I read that out for anyone who still labors under the delusion, unlike de Maistre of yourself, that the Constitution and the laws matter rather than the people enforcing the laws. I ask you this question: how do we break the spell of institutional neutrality for those liberals in coalition with us who still, after watching BLM and lockdowns, think the laws matter, not the people enforcing them?
I think it's very difficult because, again, once we recognize that, once we acknowledge that truth, the only conclusion we can draw is that we are people under authority, that we are people who will be ruled, that there will be a ruling class, there will be rulers, and there will be ruled, and that the those that wield that authority will make decisions. This is the point of both de Maistre and Schmidt. It really ultimately is that decisionism rules the day. It is the person who actively decides, who goes ahead and puts themselves out there, takes the risks, has the force of charisma, opportunity, and intelligence to make those decisions, that ultimately gains the moral authority to do so. And that's something that's terrifying for a lot of people because we would much rather believe that we are ruled by some impersonal system, something that has been finely tuned by the greatest minds to go ahead and always come to the great conclusions of our day. We all know that individuals can make terrible mistakes, that they can become tyrannical. That's obvious to us. But if we can disperse that order among a large number of learned technocrats, it becomes harder and harder to see until it culminates into something like the pandemic in 2020. And so I think that the real difficulty for the liberal is to understand that, well, politics is not solved. We are not at the end of history. This is not all over, and that existential struggles are real and will continue. But that's very difficult because they have all told themselves that they live in an age where these problems have been overcome. They are no longer the irrational religious person. They are the highly advanced technocrat who can go ahead and bring all of these miracles of modernity about through the manipulation of these systems. I don't think you can really go ahead and tell the liberal ruling class that they need to change this any more than you can tell, I guess, the average Marxist that you can't have a centrally planned economy. It's necessary to their power. And so they won't know things that knowing would eventually cause them to lose power.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m., only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.